Hello, good evening, everyone. This is Clyde Shirati from Africa Media Australia for another edition of Afroshine Live. Thank you very much for those who continue to watch and comment and contribute to the show. We are live from Melbourne, Australia, as usual, and it's all about highlighting the excellence and the success of the members of the African Australian communities, as well as talking about issues that affect the advancement of the communities, both here and abroad. So today we will be talking about Africa's economic future. We'll be discussing this topic with a special guest that is joining us tonight from Melbourne. His name is Victor Perton. He is the Chief Optimism Officer at the Center for Optimism. Good evening, Victor. How are you today?
Oh, Clyde, I'm extremely well. Thanks for asking. And it's a great honor and a privilege to be on your program. There's an effervescence and a joy about it that really is compelling viewing. So I'm greatly honored to be with you.
Thank you very much for your time to Africa Media Australia. We know that you're a busy person and we appreciate the time for coming to our show. Now, I'm going to start by just asking you to introduce yourself a little bit, give us a bit more information about what you do so that people have an understanding of who you are.
Sure. So, as you said, I'm the Chief Optimism Officer of the Center for Optimism. And so people are really welcome. We'd welcome members of the African Australian community, and we already have many members who are there because it is a very optimistic community. Many people have come here as refugees and migrants, and as you know, refugees and migrants tend to be more optimistic anyway. So what is the Centre for Optimism? It actually is the offspring of an earlier project called the Australian Leadership Project, where we were trying to figure out why Australian attitudes to leadership had become so negative. I'd come back from several years as Trade Commissioner in North and South America, and everywhere I went, there was this very positive stereotype of Australia and Australians. And the chairman of Caterpillar said to me, "You Aussies remind me of the Americans of 100 years ago. Nothing is impossible." The Secretary General of the Rio Olympics said, "Look, I want an Olympic Games as good as Sydney, a legacy as good as Melbourne 56. And after that, I'd worked on the G20. As you know, several African countries there. And it was exactly the same at that super elite level, this incredible positivity and trust towards Australians. And then I came back to Melbourne in 2015 and was astonished by the negativity. So we interviewed 2,500 Australians and foreigners on the traits of Australian leadership. At the end of that, we were still bewildered as to the negativity. And then my eureka moment came in late 2017 at the Global Integrity Summit. It's not so much a problem with the leadership, it's a fog of pessimism. So the mission of the Centre for Optimism is to ask people what makes you optimistic. And Clyde, as I warned you, what makes you optimistic?
Well, I'm happy to answer the question, even though I'll be doing most of the asking tonight. But what makes me optimistic, I guess, is because I think that in life you get what you prepare yourself for. Being optimist is an important thing because although there are issues, but whatever you focus on, that's what usually you magnify and usually end up getting. So I want to look at the positive side of things. I want to have a positive stance on things because that prepares my mind and my whole consciousness to be able to achieve that. That's essentially why I'm an optimistic person by nature.
Beautifully put, Clyde. The definition we use for optimism is that things will work out in the end. And some of my friends then add a few extra words to that, which is, if it hasn't worked out yet, it's not the end. So it's the underpinning of innovation. It's the underpinning of entrepreneurship. It's the underpinning of resilience. And you, Clyde, you exemplified. You you came from a difficult country, you came to Australia, you've made a life here, and now you're giving back to the African-Australian community and the Australian-African relationship. So you epitomise the optimist mindset.
Absolutely, and that is very important in life. And I'm glad to know, and we're having a little conversation just before the show, where you noted that a lot of Africans are quite optimistic in life, despite all the difficult things that some of us go through in our life journey, and from the backgrounds that we may come from. But anyway, let's go into the topic tonight.
No, can I just interrupt you? That is a really interesting point. Optimism in Australia is at the lowest level ever. Same with New Zealand, and we're now starting to match the figures in Western Europe, where there's been an element of pessimism for at least a decade or two. But Africa, very optimistic in the north, very optimistic in the south, and it's part of the reason that I've got such a confidence in Africa as the economic future. A young, intelligent, vibrant, optimistic population, I think are all of the things that Africa needs for success.
Absolutely. That is important. You just mentioned that as Africa as a bright economic future. Tell us a bit more about that, because from Australia, when you look at things, there seems to be a lot of tendency to think of Africa in a negative way. There's a lot of stereotypes, and people have been usually watching a lot of negative images coming from Africa in the media, and that develops into a lot of things. But there are people who understand that Africa has a bright economic future, and Australia can play a role in that. What do you think about that?
Well, you're a former journalist, so you know that the news has changed over the last 50 years. So when I was young, the news was roughly 50-50, good, bad. And you'd get good stories from Africa, positive stories, what's happening in conservation, freedom fighting and all of these things. But now the news is nearly 95% bad. So it doesn't matter whether it's news coverage of Australia or Africa or Latin America or the United States. If you obtain your knowledge through the news, you're unlikely to get a positive mindset. But I think you're right. I mean, it's, there is this, when I was young, it was a rite of passage that Australians would go by truck, from South Africa through to Europe. And, tens of thousands of young Australians did that and built their knowledge. And you meet those people, they're running mining companies, agricultural companies, either working in Africa or invested in Africa or with good relations in Africa, so that the people who've actually been to Africa and know Africa have a very positive mindset. But, what we tend to get on the news is corruption or war or terrorism or, dare I say it, in northern Nigeria, kidnapping of girls. So these things do tend to give a negative stereotype, but there are similar negative stereotypes to parts of Asia, to parts of Latin America. So Africa's not on its own, but I think Australians who know Africa well, and I think of a lot of people in Melbourne here who've built, incredibly strong relationships with, for instance, Rwanda and the like. Those relationships are being fostered and getting ever stronger. So, sure, there's a negative stereotype, but the people who know how to get through that. I've got friends, for instance, in Kenya and Uganda, African-born friends who are actively fighting to reduce the levels of corruption and to allow companies that won't pay bribes to work together to foster their economic relationships. And I was even in the United States recently. I gave a speech, before the lockdown, I was in Phoenix to give a speech to the International Association of Contract and Commercial Management. This wonderful Nigerian lady got up and said, look, I've lived in America for 25 years. I'm now going back to Nigeria, to work on the health system, to improve the health system. So you've got this, a bit like India in some senses, you've got this wonderful group of Africans who've moved to places to get, higher education and the like, and then feel very comfortable coming back with their networks and their friends to build an ever stronger African economy. And after we talked this morning in preparation for the television show, I looked back again, what Australia imports from Africa, and it's surprisingly high tech. We import cars, machinery, and of course, my favorite, of course, coffee. I must contribute to the trade imbalance through my consumption of those wonderful varieties of coffee grown in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between optimism, innovation, and entrepreneurship as it relates to Africa. Africa now is being recognized as I suppose I would want to say the next China, in a sense that it's likely to be the next engine of the global economy, and there are a lot of opportunities for business out there. How do you see optimism connecting with innovation, entrepreneurship, which is necessary for that to sustain that economic growth?
You've nailed everything there, Clyde, except the China thing. What I love about Africa is it's not like China. You do have a few, you have some dictatorships, but you don't have this overwhelming security state forcing one ideology on people. It doesn't matter what country you're in Africa, there's these wild ideological and political debates and freedom of thought, which is the fundamental for entrepreneurship. The fundamental for innovation. So the work we've done at the Centre for Optimism and in cooperation with other research centres is firstly that what the world is looking for is infectiously optimistic leadership. Dominic Barton, who was the head of McKinsey, Jeremy Johnson, Iger, who's just stood down as the chairman of Disney, all say it's infectious optimism. And you think back to Mandela and others, who endured imprisonment and humiliation, and yet came back to lead countries in astonishingly positive ways. I was in Rwanda not long after the genocide, and to see the way in which government was trying to bring people together, to bring the two sides together in a very optimistic view of the human spirit, fills me full of confidence for Africa. And then secondly, optimism is the underpinning of innovation. You can't be an innovator unless you're optimistic, unless you are prepared to have a go and fail and have another go and fail. And, I've seen, I had some good experiences in Botswana and Rwanda and South Africa, and to see women entrepreneurs, bringing flowers, vegetables, all sorts of things into the global supply chain. And then, when you look at Nigeria and others, the number of young people and older people like us, Clyde, getting into the IT sector.
We are getting old.
And services. And I was even looking at the import figures of Australia from Nigeria, and I was surprised by the level of clothing. So you say, is it the new China? No, but it's, it is a centre for fashion and clothing and to see these things. So innovation is crucial, but the real engine, I think, of the future African economy, and when I see the signs of success across Africa, is the entrepreneurship. And you can't be an entrepreneur unless you're an optimist. Now, as one of my friends who runs one of the world's biggest medical devices firms says, you can't be in this industry unless you're an optimist, but it's an optimism based in reality. You have to have a good strategy, a good business plan. I can't use the phrase he uses, which is an OSHIT plan. But, to be prepared in the event of stuff that's gone down, like, the COVID virus and its impact on the economy. So for me, when I look at the statistics on Africa, when I interview Africans on their optimism, it's clear that will be the engine. And look, I think the figures are Africa's going to have 25% of the world's population by 2050. I think 40% of the world's population by 2100. And I might not be alive, but my children will be alive in 2100. It fills me full of confidence. So I come back to what you said. Is it the new China? No, because China's a dictatorship, and that will hamper it. I think Africa's vitality and debate and argument will make it ever stronger. And I think we'll all be going to Africa cap in hand looking for investors in the years to come. And we'll be, just as the Brazilians have come to Australia, and bought large parts of the abattoir industry. Australia is a very open economy, and it's sometimes when you look at where the investment's coming from, it's not all coming from the United States, Japan, China. There's some really interesting and diverse investments coming from places like Mexico, like Brazil. And, we see stuff, investments here in the retail sector coming from Africa itself. I don't think many people know that companies like David Jones
actually it's South African. Absolutely. A lot of people don't seem to have that type of information, and that's a shame. But you've mentioned investment there. Do you see Australia do you think Australia is able to, I suppose, capitalize on the opportunities that being presented in Africa in terms of how they can increase the trade flow between these two continents? Is the Australian government and the private sector paying sufficient attention to those opportunities?
We've always got to remember we're only 25 million people. And even though we are almost a top 10 economy and we're being invited to the G7, making us the G7 and a half, I guess, it's still only 25 million people. And where do they pay their attention? I think when you go to Perth in Western Australia, there's a very strong focus on Africa. And it's the mining sector and the agricultural sector. And then, of course, Melbourne, where I live, you could walk the streets of Collins, you could walk Collins Street or St Kilda Road, and there's lots of people familiar with Africa, particularly the mining sector and the agricultural sector. And when you think of the Australian Stock Exchange, it is ground zero for the investment in the mining sector. So, there's 170 listed Australian companies in Africa, but add to that hundreds more private companies. We could be better, but there's an informed group of people, and it's people like you and me building more networks. It's if I think when I first went to China in 1987 to study at Beijing University, how many Australians were there who'd been to university in China? How many Chinese had been to Australia? But in the 30 years that have followed, there's been this extraordinary growth. And for instance, Monash University, has its campus in South Africa. What are the relationships being built there? This astonishingly intelligent and vibrant African migration that's coming here from, such a range of countries. I mean, your former country, everyone I meet from your country, from your birth country, is either a PhD or a master's, and just utterly brilliant. So we've been so fortunate in the African migration here. And the government has its relationship body in DFAT. I think the Australian government's doing its best, but could you do more? I think the answer is always yes. Could we do better? Yes. But one of the things I get people to do when I do a keynote speech, Clyde, is I get them to get up and shout out, "The leader looks like the person in my mirror." And it's up to you and me. The poor old foreign minister, she's got so many things going on in her head. It's up to you and me to remind her of the opportunities of Africa, and to remind Simon Birmingham, the trade minister, and to remind the chambers of commerce. And but particularly when there's a mining conference on in Melbourne, you see a heck of a lot of African governments and trade organizations. When there's a big agricultural conference on, Again, you
Mm,
see a lot of interrelationships, and even in the medical sector now. I mean, we look at, for instance, the work Monash is doing on malaria, for instance.
mm,
Um, it's one of those great connectors. Or, today I got an email from one of the vision organisations, and the medical work that's going on between Australia and Africa, you often don't see in the trade figures,
mm.
but it's part of building the relationships.
Absolutely. Let me remind those who are watching live that we would appreciate you making comments and asking questions. We'll get our guests to answer some of the questions later on. But please make a comment. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us, including actually some other things that you would like us to touch on, either as part of this specific show today or other episodes that we'll be running in the future. Now,
Actually,
um,
Clyde, can we ask them to tell us
yeah.
what makes them optimistic about Africa-Australia relations?
Well,
Or what
that's
makes
that's
them optimistic, full stop? They don't have to ask us a question. We can ask your viewers a question. What
That's
makes
right. Yeah,
them optimistic, and get them to share that?
very good suggestion. Please take a minute or two to write something about why you are optimistic. If you are, you could be not optimistic. I don't want to use the other word, but if you are
I
optimistic,
can't
what makes
imagine
you?
there'd be any pessimist watching you, Clyde.
Who knows? There may be people out there.
All they've got to, our
So
first rule of an optimist, Clyde, is to smile. And every time you smile, you light up the world.
thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. Now, what do you think should be done in order to encourage more um, business, more connection between Australia and Africa?
I think the new Colombo plan, to extend the new Colombo plan to Africa would be a good thing. So the original Colombo plan brought lots of people from Asia to study in Australia in the 1950s and the 1960s. And many of the 70s even, many of them went on to become prime ministers and senior business people. And that created an incredibly strong bond between Australia and Asian countries. And in the last 10 years, we've actually done the reverse. We
Mm,
encourage our university students to go and spend one semester in an Asian university, and the government's funding of placements, and there's a travel bursary. So I'd look to extending that and maybe building upon the Monash relationship in South Africa. But number one is to build that. Now, it's long term, but as we said, 40% of the world's population will live in Africa by 2050. So if we
mm,
can get young people talking to each other, whether it's studying, whether it's romance, whatever it is, but it's those youthful relationships that we talked about at the beginning of the interview, that when I was young, traveling by truck across Africa was a rite of passage. Today, you don't see that so much. The borders are not so easy. So number one
mm,
is those relationships. Number two is what you and I are doing. So one of the things I'm doing with various communities, so my Centre for Optimism has 2,500 members in 52 countries. We're building an astonishing network of optimists. And so if we can help people to network better,
mm.
and using LinkedIn, using Facebook, using Twitter, that will extend things. Because oftentimes one of my irritations is that you still get a lot of Nigerian spam, as it's called.
Mm.
And so it's sort of, you look at someone sending you a link from LinkedIn from Nigeria and you think, is it real or not real?
Yeah,
In a way that you wouldn't
that's right.
if
With
it
other
came
people.
from somewhere else. So again, it's a stereotype.
Yeah.
And I've got good friends in Nigeria, but you always have that sort of double look. So for the things that you and I can do and your listeners can do is just make one new friend each week. And engage, and don't just do it by email. Email's not effective anymore. It's, talking on the phone. It's Zoom video now is so normal. Who
Mm-hmm.
can imagine a year ago, we all used to still pick up the phone or catch a plane. Today, you
That's
can build
right.
astonishingly good relationships by video. And, perhaps next time we do one of these, Clyde,
Yeah,
we get a couple of Australian business people who've never been to Africa,
that's
and
right.
we get a couple of African businessmen or businessmen and women who've
Yeah.
never been to Australia, and we get them talking.
Absolutely, that's a very good suggestion. I'll be happy to organize that, and that's one of the benefits of this whole COVID thing. It's kind of pushing people to get online, and Zoom has become an everyday thing from everywhere in the world, and people who were not doing Zoom before, they are able to do it now. So we can utilize that opportunity to make more connection. And I do agree with the point that the networking and real networking, not just emailing each other, but building relationship, calling and talking to people. That is actually very important. What would
The
you
sound of the
suggest?
voice, Clyde, it's
Yeah,
it's lost in the email.
yeah,
It's the sound of the human voice, and y- just watching someone. You gauge so much from someone's face and their joviality, their friendliness. So I think I accept the challenge if you accept the challenge
yeah,
of getting a few Australians who've never been to Africa,
yeah.
because we normally do these things with people who've been there.
Exactly.
Yeah, we normally have these conversations with people who know the place. I think the challenge you and I have got is actually connecting people who've never met and never traveled to each other's continent.
Mm, I'm happy to take that challenge, and we can definitely give it a go. Um, I suppose we may go into some of the questions we're starting to get from the membership, and I still, I mean, from the members of the audience. I still want to remind you to say why you are optimistic in life. While you're asking questions, you're making comments. Don't forget, it's all about that optimism that we are talking about. So it's very important. I have Kaleki who says, my question to Mr. Victor is: China is aggressively extending its tentacles in Africa as a way of giving Greek gifts and loans. Do you think this is the best interest of Africa, and what do you think can be done?
Well, I think Kalekwe is a good scholar of the classics, the old Trojan horse.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I studied in China back in the 80s, and so I think I know the country reasonably well, and particularly we've been looking at what they've been doing in Hong Kong. I think what you see, with the Chinese PRC influence. So this is not a smear against Chinese people in general. A lot of Chinese business people and investors who live all around the world are some of the best people in the world for doing business and networking and the like. But the
Mm-hmm.
influence of the Chinese Communist Party is extremely damaging. And we know that in Africa, they've been lending money, not giving grants, but lending money for infrastructure projects built by Chinese workers. So I think and I think the Congo is one of those examples, isn't it? Where,
Absolutely.
there's been so-called Chinese investment, but it hasn't delivered local jobs. They've brought in their own workforce, they've brought in their own food. So I think that the question is rhetorical. I think it is a very, very negative influence, both in terms of integrity. There's no absence of appetite on their part to pay bribes and to pay bribes at the highest level. So, the quandary is, of course, they turn up with the cash.
Yeah.
And, they say we want to invest in a railway or the like, but we keep reading negative stories about the railway never reaching the end or the highway falling apart. So, Africa has to be, like Australia's been, a great advocate for its own foreign direct investment. So we could talk at great length about this because, of course, Australia has
Yeah.
the same problem now. We've got a lot of Chinese investment. And every time we speak up about human rights or the like, they threaten us and, we'll stop taking meat from a particular abattoir, or we'll stop sending our students there. Or at the moment, they're running a campaign that says it's unsafe to be in Australia. Well, crikeys, I think I'd rather be in Australia with no COVID than in China. So I think it was a brilliant question. And yeah, I think if you could avoid Communist Party of China investment, I think your country would be well served.
Now, do you think this whole attitude from China's government and the Communist Party, the ruling party there, is likely to drive investment out of China, and that places like Africa can fill some of the gap?
Yeah. In fact, I was part of an international consortium talking to one of the North African countries the other day. And they are looking to take advantage of the fact that Western countries have realized they've got too many eggs in one basket. Too much investment in China, too much reliance on China as a supplier. And this particular country is looking to take advantage of that. It's got shorter shipping routes to Europe. It's got trade relationships with the EU that allow its products to go in. And I think it's a great opportunity for African entrepreneurs to break the supply chain. I was on a program similar to this the other day, but the co-guest was a fellow who owned a clothing manufacturing enterprise, 42 factories around the world, and they were certainly ramping up their African operations. And as I said, I mean, we look at, for instance, imports to Australia from Nigeria. I was actually surprised at the amount of clothing that's coming from Africa now. So I think whether it's clothing or automobiles or parts, medications, agricultural products, processed food products, I think there's a real appetite for Africa as an alternative to China. So I think you've nailed it, Clyde. There's a real, and you've got to grab it. I think the next 5 years, it'll be people saying we're more reliable on the supply chain. It's a shorter route. And whether it's Europe or Australia or the United States, I actually think, this is the COVID will prove to be a great advantage to Africa.
And do you think,
and of course, Africa's got a youthful population. It's not like Europe or China or Japan where, we've really had to shut down because of the relative age of the community.
yeah,
Africa's a young continent.
And what advice would you give to the African diaspora here in Australia that may serve as a link between the African government and private sector and the international investors, China being one, Australia being another, and many other in the Asia Pacific region?
I think particularly it's getting around and visiting, right? I mean, we've got food production. I think there's no doubt at all that people want more diverse supply chains around processed food. I think there's no doubt at all they want more diverse supply chains around medical products. No doubt at all they want more diverse supply chains in advanced manufacturing. And, the advanced manufacturing side. So I'm helping out Bendigo, which is a regional city in southeastern Australia. We're having an invention and innovation festival. And the big element of that is advanced manufacturing. And you see that, as we've talked about earlier, the incredible high levels of training in engineering, high production values in Africa. I think for the diaspora, it's a matter of getting around, making sure you get to the Melbourne Chamber of Commerce, the Australian Chamber of Commerce, and just talk. And you've talked to me in the past about opportunities that are there. Now, I got used to, when I lived in America, of ringing people 12 times before I thought they weren't going to talk to me. So I have a friend called Sue Barrett, and Sue says everyone lives by selling something.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it is being a good salesman.
Yeah.
And I do find the opportunity, oftentimes people will come, and this was always, for me as a trade commissioner, it was interesting, because you could come and talk about how good Australia was, but people actually wanted to know what the product was, who the producer was. And so we, for instance, we took wine trade missions down the West Coast. We took sports trade missions into Latin America. And and for instance, Boeing used to say to us, "Don't bring us a trade mission, bring us one company that can do something really well." So it is also more than just talk. It is about making that connection between someone who can make something and someone who needs something.
Absolutely, that definitely does make sense. I suppose,
I think we've got a question from Yassir.
yes, we got a question from Yasia. He says, maybe if you agree with me, for instance, when a Western country with a mining resource can be seen developing the country and the people share the wealth through delivering better services. But when we see a country in Africa has mining resources, the country do not make any change in its infrastructure, no jobs for their people, or do not see government in Africa spend to deliver quality service to its people. So I suppose looking at what is happening in Africa, the government, they have to lift their games as well, isn't it?
It's true. I mean, if you look at Australia, what are we? We are a mining and agricultural country,
Mm,
but with an astonishing standard of living. And if we probably go back to 1850, South Africa was probably a more advanced economy than Australia was.
mm.
Nigeria was probably a more advanced economy than Australia was, and it's good governance that has really been Australia's good fortune. We've been very lucky with the English institutions haven't served every country well. Colonial institutions haven't served every country well, but Australia has indeed been very fortunate. And there's a lot of luck in it, Clyde. My parents were refugees from the Soviet Union. You came from Central Africa. And when we look at the blend of people who've come to Australia, the mixture has been people who want democracy, people who want freedom, people who don't want strong government. And of course, some people will say, oh, the government should be stronger in Australia. But I think it's the way Australians like it. We actually have quite a small government sector, but good regulations. And so it is the challenge for Africa. I know shortly after the end of apartheid, I went to South Africa to help with the structuring of the regulatory system. Now, of course, that got captured by the ANC, and I won't put that down as one of my great successes, Clyde. I went with all goodwill to try and help create a good regulatory system.
Yeah.
But of course, what became nearly a one-party state
Yes.
is exactly what Yassi is talking about. So I've got some good mates, and we might have a conversation at some point on the Blue Chamber of Commerce and this notion of, companies that won't pay bribes, getting together and making sure they do business together.
Yeah.
And so I'll see if those guys are interested in coming on your show.
Absolutely.
And talking about that, because it's a really positive development.
It is.
And it's not government led. It's led by the private sector supporting the private sector. So Yassi's put it really well. Australia's been very fortunate in how we've lived, but we are exactly as most of Africa is, a resources and agricultural economy.
Absolutely, and which is why I think there's a good potential there between Africa and Australia, because the agricultural industry, for example, is one where I see very good symbiotic relationship where Australia can give something to Africa and get something back. Anyway, we have another question
that's
from
really a really good point. So, for instance, the Victorian Agricultural Laboratories, led by Herman Spangenberg. They're some of the world leaders around genetic modification of crops in order to defeat climate change and drought. And that is one of the areas of great cooperation between Australia and Africa, helping to get new species of grain that will be more productive, and allow greater exports of product.
That's good, and I remember just recently I was talking with a group of professionals, African professionals. We were talking about how we can do more to help boost the agricultural sector, because there's a lot of things happening in the mining sector, but there's very little happening in the agriculture sector, where we think there's quite a lot of potential, because mining can go up and down all the time, but agriculture is something that is just going to continue move forward. So perhaps with some of your contacts and your advice, you can help us to develop that more. Let's go to the next question from Kenyatta, who says, please advise on how government of South Sudan can diversify the economy to effectively support suffering people who are dying every day. So specifically talking about South Sudan here, but that could apply for many other government in Africa in the same sort of situation.
I don't have the answer to that one, I'm afraid. I think Kenyatta nailed one of the most difficult problems in the world. I think are there still three factions fighting there?
Well, I'm not sure. I think Kenyatta can answer. There's still some issues. It sort of goes up and down. Sometimes they seem to be, getting together. There's been a new government that has been formed recently, a government of national unity, but there's still some sort of issues there, and Kenyatta probably would know that better. By the way, Kenyatta, if you want to even make a video comment, we can bring you into the studio if you want to comment on that. But if you want to do more text comment, please go ahead and do that. One more thing I would like to talk about is the role of the sort of a female entrepreneurship. I've seen that growing in the local African diaspora community here, and I know in Australia there's a lot of female entrepreneurship, and females are sort of in middle management everywhere. We're wanting them to be even more present in boardrooms and all that. What sort of advice would you give from here to help African countries to develop that aspect of entrepreneurship?
Well, I think that's one of the areas where there's a lot of government support if you want to do partnership programs on that. But I just recall my last couple of trips to Africa, the number of incredibly strong, well-educated entrepreneurial women who are leading businesses in Africa. So I don't think they're shrinking violets. I think they are very much at the forefront. So I think this is time. I mean, I'm a 60-year-old man. I think we're out of fashion. I think that female entrepreneur is in fashion. And so all we can, people like you and me, Clyde, the best thing we can do is to help connect them up. And I particularly, I often will do interviews as you do. I publish the stories of hope and optimism of entrepreneurs. And so, I'm more than happy to provide a platform for, those female entrepreneurs, whether they're from the African Australian population or in Africa themselves. I think their time has come. So I don't think you and I are going to have to do much for them. I think they're more than prepared to do it from themselves. And I think just one thing, I think Kenyatta's come back and said the fighting is still ongoing in South Sudan. And I think, obviously, I mean, I don't want to sound like a peacenik, but one of the things we do have to keep working on is, people of goodwill like you and me and Kenyatta and others, can we help bring about peace through optimism? Can we bring peace through hope?
It's a tough question.
We talked about China earlier, and of course the great Chinese Maoist expression is power grows through the barrel of a gun. It seems to be the problem in the United States at the moment. The reason the police are often so rough is that they're so scared of people carrying guns. And if we can do something to diminish the fighting and bring peace to the South Sudan and other parts of Africa, Central Africa, people would be able to be more entrepreneurial and more successful.
Absolutely.
But that one's a bit beyond me, Kenyatta. If I can do something in my next 30 years of running the Centre for Optimism, happy to work with you on that and see what we can do.
I suppose there is really a good opportunity for the broader African Australian community here, the diaspora, to look at how they can benefit from some of the work you're doing, because being part of the community, and I attend a lot of events, speak to a lot of people, you tend to see that although Africans in general are very optimistic, but the diaspora community here, when they look at what's happening in Africa, they tend to take a more negative view is because they are discouraged of the fact that the governments back in Africa are not always doing the right thing, and that discouragement drives them into pessimism, which I suppose is quite detrimental to Africa, because the diaspora has to play an active role in lifting Africa up, both economically and even politically, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I come from Soviet refugees, and for my younger life, it was going to events and trying to maintain the culture in the face of Soviet oppression. And of course, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and my parents' homelands became free. So sometimes it takes time. If we look at Sri Lanka, how long did it take them to bring peace to Sri Lanka? And even there, it's not perfect. Or if we look at Ireland, for instance, how many hundreds of years were they fighting in Ireland? And yet today, after only sort of really 20 years of peace, the prosperity that's come. So I think we just have to work together and maybe have a couple of sessions.
Yes.
And one of the things, for instance, I'm doing with some communities is creating voices of optimism.
Yeah.
So maybe the challenge to having a look who's there: Kenyatta, Chisholm, Yasir, Kaleki, Alpha, Prince. Send us your expressions of what makes you optimistic. And let's start to build a collection. And maybe, Clyde, if we built a collection of 1 million optimists in Africa, we'd make a huge difference.
I certainly believe that we do need more optimism within African communities and from African perspective back in the continent, because
and networking. Come back to networking, optimism, and networking.
And networking, yeah, absolutely.
Getting to know more people all the time, and then making that commitment. If you make a commitment, keep the commitment. I've so enjoyed. I've done some work with the African refugee community around Shepparton.
Yeah, I remember you was working with Rachidi there and all that sort of thing.
They're vibrant. They're heading into the health sector. They're heading into the agricultural sector. And there's a really interesting study from the University of Melbourne when they interviewed the children of refugees, including the children of refugees from Africa. 90% of them were optimistic about their future life and career in Australia, compared to only 55% of native-born Australians. So
that's interesting.
The younger generation of African migrants and their children know they can make it because they're talented, they're intelligent, and well-educated. And we just have to. One of the areas is the networking, because of course, if you're first generation, you don't have those networks.
That's right.
You have in any country, you've got not ruling elites, but you've got elites.
Yeah.
Who run the corporations and the like. And if you're a new migrant, it's bloody hard work to break that. Now, in Australia, at least, it's easier. The Australian system is much more open than, say, France or Germany or even, dare I say, the United States. But Australia is still an open society where if you're intelligent, articulate, and you can network well, the sky's the limit.
You'll be able to make it. Before we finish, one last question. We're actually running out of time. And that's coming from Kenyatta, actually, who says, can you comment on Black Lives Matter rallies in Australia and America in relation to George Floyd? We'll finish with that.
A really good question, Kenyatta. And we've in fact created a page at the Centre for Optimism on exactly that issue. What is it? What comes next? And I think, there's a very much an American issue. Having lived in America, if you got stopped by a traffic cop, he'd have 2 guns on his hips like John Wayne. It was like an armed camp. I remember my kids. We were stopped for a very minor traffic offence in Virginia. And the kids, I had to do sort of mocking humour with the kids because otherwise it was quite a terrifying and frightening thing to be stopped by armed American police for what wouldn't even be a traffic offence here in Melbourne. So I think the I think there's a real change. I think, yeah, but we've got to move forward and seize it, Kenyatta. I think there's an energy now, but if people only think marching in the street is going to solve the problem, it's not. Optimism is empty if it's not accompanied by action. And look, if we just pick up Yassir's comment as that last one, and if I can read it out, that's all right. When I see our young people come with innovative thinking or ideas to improve our people's life, that gives me optimism that one day we will get through our African challenges together. And I think that nails it. See, people talk about innovation, but they don't talk about the underpinning factor, which is optimism. People talk about wanting resilience, but they don't talk about the underpinning figure of optimism. People talk about wanting leadership, but the leadership that people want is infectiously optimistic leadership, not the man who stands at the front on the podium, giving the rah-rah speech. They want the leader who can infect other people with that optimism. And I think, Clyde, when you say some of the leadership talks negatively about Africa and pessimistically about Africa, I don't think there's ever been a leader who's a pessimist that people have wanted to follow. So I think, Yassir, if we can get those young people, the optimists, into more positions of leadership, the game is won. And then lesson number one from Clyde in hosting this thing is smile like an optimist. Laugh like an optimist.
I am certainly doing that. Victor Perton, thank you very much for taking the time to have a chat with us. And I would certainly want to actually be able to do more of this because I think there's a lot of value in the work that you are doing at the Center of Optimism, and how we can bring that into the networks of African professionals and business leaders and all the young people who are trying to play a role in trying to make progress for African communities here and abroad. So I
when we
will
finish this interview, Clyde, I'll put a discount code onto our website. It'll be called Clyde.
Yeah.
And if anyone wants a free subscription to the Center for Optimism, leave it 10 minutes, but type in Clyde as the discount code to the subscription, and it'll be free for a year.
Wow, that's good. That's good. That's a very good gift, and I will communicate with our audiences and other networks that I belong to take advantage of that. And we'll certainly have another session sometime very soon where I'm happy to take that challenge of connecting people who have never been to Africa, never been to Australia, and do a few more things beyond that as well. So thank you very much. I won't take too much of your time.
Optimism Cafe, Clyde. We'll do it. We'll do it on My Optimism Cafe, and then we'll bring them back onto your show.
No worries. All good. All good.
You have to
all
come
right.
And star on the Optimism Cafe.
Absolutely. Happy to come there anytime. Thank you again for your time, and have a good night. And thank for all of our audiences. Continue to watch, continue to share our videos. And if you have something to share that brings value to the community, this platform is open for you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Clyde.
Thank you.